Shalom Talmidim, greetings scholars, and welcome to this introductory video on the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. In the following tutorial, I'll be showing you each of the letters in sequence, beginning with some of the earliest forms that you find them in ancient writing, and then going up into their final printed form as you find them, for example, in the BHS, or Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Along with each letter, you will have a short video on how to write each of these letters in the modern cursive script, which should make it easier for you to write them quickly. And yet at the same time, it's important that you learn how to recognize the print forms in order to read your Hebrew Bible. Let's begin.
As we get started, here are a few things to remember. First of all, the Hebrew language reads from right to left on the page. Second, Hebrew has a consonantal alphabet. All vowel pointings were added later on. Third, Hebrew has no lowercase letters. And fourth and final, some Hebrew letters have a final form. The first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph. The name for this letter comes from the word for ox, in which the letter Aleph is the first sound. As you may notice, some of the earliest forms of these letters even look like the pictures of the nouns used for their names. Something that can be a challenge for beginning students in Hebrew to understand is that the letter Aleph is not the vowel sound A, because the Hebrew alphabet proper has no vowels, but is rather what linguists call a glottal stop. English itself has the glottal stop, but it often goes unrecognized because it is not represented by any of our letters. For example, in the enunciated phrase, I ate oranges, even though each of the words would be written beginning with a vowel, they begin in actual pronunciation with a glottal stop, which is the sound of the glottis, or vocal cords, briefly closing and then opening to release air from the lungs. Thus, even the Hebrew words ish, aim, and ohel, though we might think of them as beginning with the vowel sounds e, a, and o, are words that also begin with the letter Aleph.
First, I'll show you how to write the Aleph in cursive Hebrew. By the way, these templates that we're using here for writing the Hebrew letters can be found on our Blackboard site. If you go there, you'll be able to print those out if you need them. So for the Aleph, you'll begin by writing a small letter C. And then right next to it, a diagonal line. Alright, simple enough. Let's try another one. Remember to keep these close together so that they're not mistaken for two letters. Small letter C, diagonal line. There you have it. That's the Aleph.
The next letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Beit, the name of which corresponds to the Hebrew word bayit, house. Beit has two pronunciations in Hebrew, depending on whether or not it has the dagesh. With the dagesh, it is pronounced like the letter B in boy. Without the dagesh, it sounds like V in voyage.
The second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, or better yet, Aleph Beit, is the letter Beit. And so let me show you how to write that letter. You begin at the top, curve downward just gradually, and without lifting your pen from the paper, make another curved line below it. Just like that. Now, Beit is one of our letters in the Hebrew alphabet, which, when it has the dagesh, takes a different pronunciation. And so, without the dagesh, such as this one here, you would pronounce this like a V in English, V. This example here that has the dagesh, being that this is one of our Begad Kefat letters, when it has the dagesh, it will be pronounced like a B, Beit, B.
The next letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Gimel. Gimel, like Beit, also has two pronunciations. With the dagesh, it sounds like G in goat. Without the dagesh, it sounds like a softer G, G, in which the back of the tongue does not fully touch the roof of the mouth the way it would for a G.
Let's draw the third letter of the alphabet, the Gimel. You begin by drawing a line down, and then, right about halfway, you'll connect it to what looks like a C, just like that. Gimel is one of our other Begad Kafat letters, which means that when it takes the Dagesh, it will change the pronunciation. Without the Dagesh, Gimel sounds like a soft G, G. And with the Dagesh, it sounds like the G we're used to in English, G. You don't need to make this distinction when you are pronouncing the text.
The letter Dalet gets its name from the word for door. Like Beit and Gimel, Dalet has two pronunciations. With the Dagesh, it sounds like D in dog. Without the Dagesh, it sounds more like a soft D, the. Or you might think of it as sounding like the letters TH in the word this, but not like the TH in thought.
The fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the Dalet, is written, as best I can describe it, like a loopy 2. You begin with a nice wide arc at the top, come down, and then maybe 3/4 of the way down, just make a small loop like that. I'll show you again here. Okay. Now, Dalet is another one of those Begad Kafat letters, which means that when it takes the Dagesh, it will change in pronunciation. When it has the Dagesh, it sounds like the D we're accustomed to, duh. And without the Dagesh, it sounds like a softened D, duh.
The letter Hey sounds like H in the word house when it is at the beginning of a syllable, and, like Aleph, is usually silent if it falls at the end of a syllable.
The fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Hey, and we write it like this, beginning at the top, curving down, and then a smaller curved line beneath it. I'll show you again here. On occasion, you'll see Hey with a dot inside it, and when we're writing that in cursive, we can put the dot here. That dot is not to be confused with the Dagesh. It is called a mapik, and this is something we'll discuss in class.
The letter Vav gets its name from the word for hook, like the hooks that are used in the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus. This letter is often pronounced like V in valley. The letter Vav, like Yod, is a semi-vowel or approximate, meaning that even though it is technically a consonant, it can also function like a vowel. So, for example, the letter Vav with a dot in its center may represent the long U sound. In such a case, it is called a Vav Shurik.
The sixth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Vav, is perhaps the simplest to write. Just a straight line between our two main lines here. Make sure that you don't go beneath that line where most Hebrew letters fall, because if you do, it will start to look like the noon, and that's something we'll talk about later.
The letter Zayin is pronounced like Z in zebra. Be careful not to confuse this letter with Vav when reading the Hebrew Bible in print. They look very similar at first glance.
The seventh letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Zayin, and you can think of it like a backwards Gimel. Start again with a straight line going down, but this time instead of making a forward going C, you're going to make a backward C. Make sure that you don't get this confused with Gimel. And that is Zayin.
The letter Chet has a pronunciation that might best be likened to the CH in the Scottish word loch, as in Loch Ness or Loch Lomond, or like the CH in the northern dialects of German, as in Machen.
The eighth letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Chet. Sounds kind of like the CH in the Scottish word loch. You begin with that curved line. We've seen a few letters already that have a line like this, and then a line going down. You can think of it somewhat like a table, but remember to make that right side curved. And this is chet.
The next letter of the Hebrew alphabet is tet. These days, readers and speakers of Hebrew tend to pronounce this letter like the letter T in telephone. Originally, however, this letter was almost certainly pronounced like a T with the back of the throat, or pharynx, being constricted, as in the Arabic letter ta.
The ninth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, tet, begins from the middle rather than from the top. So you'll start here, and you're spiraling slowly outwards. That's tet.
The letter yod gets its name from the word for hand, like the biblical Hebrew yad. It is most like the English letter Y in yellow, and like the English Y or the Hebrew Vav, which we discussed earlier, the letter Yod is also an approximate or semi-vowel. Thus, in combination with certain vowel pointings, which we will discuss later in class, the Yod may indicate the long A or E sound. It may also serve as the last sound heard in the diphthong I.
The 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Yod, and it is the smallest of the letters. You write it somewhat like an upside-down backwards L. Just make sure that you curve it as well. You might also think of it somewhat like an apostrophe. And this is Yod.
The letter Qoph derives its name and original shape from the word that means palm of the hand. Qoph, like Beit, Gimel, and Dalet, has two pronunciations. With the dagesh, Qoph sounds like the letter K in king. Without the dagesh, Qoph might best be thought of as making the same sound as the letter chet, though early on in the history of the language these two consonants would not have had the same pronunciation. Qoph has two forms depending on where it occurs in the word.
The next letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Kaph, and it's like a nice, large, backward C, just like that. I'll do it again for you. Qoph also has a final form, that is when Qoph is at the end of a word. It will have the C, but then it will descend in a line that falls beneath where the typical Hebrew letter will fall. Okay? Notice also that with Qoph, being that it is a begad kafat letter, when it has the dagesh, as you see here, it is pronounced like the K that we're used to. But then without the dagesh, it is pronounced ch, chaf.
The letter lamed may be pronounced like the letter L in long.
The lamed begins well above the line where most Hebrew letters fall. And then you curve it down slightly, and it curves around at the bottom to meet back with that line. And that's lamed.
The letter mem derives its name and original shape from the word for water, like the Hebrew mayim. Mem sounds like the letter M in mountain. Like Kaph, mem has two forms based upon its position in the word.
The mem is written kind of like an N. And yet there's another form of mem, the final form, when you find it at the end of a word in Hebrew. And you begin by making something kind of like a circle, and then descending below the line, like that. Notice that the final mem, just like the final Kaph, is shorter than the forms that it occurs in when it is at the beginning or middle of a word.
The letter nun sounds like the letter N in novice. Like Kaph and mem, This letter has two forms that have to do with the position of the letter in a given word.
Nun is a letter we have to be careful with because it can be confused with a vav if we're not careful. It begins by a straight line going down, but then toward the end it curves back up, kind of like an upside down candy cane. Nun also has a final form, which begins from the top in a straight line down, but then goes beneath the typical line where most Hebrew letters cut off. This is what I mentioned earlier, that you don't want to confuse this with the vav, and that the vav would stop right here at the base where most Hebrew letters stop. Final nun descends well below that line.
The letter Samekh is to be read like the letter S in sailing.
The cursive Samekh in Hebrew is best thought of just like a simple circle. It will fit within the parameters of the typical Hebrew letter, just like that. That's Samekh.
The letter Ayin gets its name and original shape from the word for eye. These days, most readers and speakers of Hebrew pronounce it as they do the letter Aleph, though originally it would have been pronounced with a constricting of the pharynx, like the Arabic letter Ayin.
When writing the Ayin, you might think of it somewhat like a loop of string. Goes down about halfway, you form a little loop like this and then come back up. Or you might think of it like a gamma in Greek. It's somewhat like that in form, or like a unique kind of Y. That's Ayin.
The letter Pei gets its name from the word for mouth. Pei is another one of those letters that has two pronunciations. With the dagesh, Pei sounds like the letter P in package. Without the dagesh, Pei sounds like the letter F in food. Pei is also one of those letters that has two forms that relate to its placement in a word.
Pei is another letter that, like tet, begins from the middle, and I've found that students can sometimes confuse this letter with tet in their writing, so be careful about that. This is Pei. Pei, like Kaph or Mem or Nun, has a final form, so when you find it at the end of a word, you should write it in cursive Hebrew like this, beginning above the line and coming back down like that. Pei is also one of our Begad Kafat letters, so when it has the dagesh within it, it's pronounced like a P, and when it does not have the dagesh, it's pronounced like our F.
The letter Tsade is pronounced by many Hebrew speakers today like a combination of the letters T and S, as for example in the word tsunami. Originally, this letter would have almost certainly been pronounced like an S accompanied by a constricting of the pharynx, as in the Arabic letter Sad. Tsade also has an initial or medial and a final form.
The letter Tsade in Hebrew always begins above the line where most Hebrew letters fall. You might think of it somewhat like an elongated 3. Tsade also has a final form, which itself begins above the line, and then curves downward and back in on itself like that. This is not to be confused with the final Pei, which, if you recall, looks like this. Note the distinction, final Tsade and final Pei.
The letter Qoph is pronounced by many Hebrew speakers today like the letter K in king, or like the Hebrew letter Kaph with the dagesh. Originally, this letter would have sounded like the letter K if it were pronounced at the back of the throat, as in the Arabic letter Qaph, as it appears in the name of that well-known holy book of Islam, Al-Quran. This is because Qoph, like Tet, Ayin, and Tsade, was originally one of the pharyngeal consonants, or consonants that are pronounced at the back of the throat.
The Qoph has only one form, and that form always descends below the line. just like this. Begin with that curved line, and then another line that drops below the typical Hebrew letter, and that is Qoph.
The letter Resh gets its name from what in biblical Hebrew is the word Rosh, head. In the Masoretic tradition of the Hebrew Bible, Resh is treated like a guttural, that is, like one of the letters Aleph, He, Chet, or Ayin that come from the throat. Therefore, you might think of the pronunciation of Resh like that of the letter R in French or German, as in regard or recht, which is pronounced at the back of the mouth around the uvula. There exists another pronunciation of Resh among some Hebrew speakers, which would correspond to the way this letter is typically pronounced in other Semitic languages, that sounds like the Spanish letter era in a word like regalo. If either of these pronunciations is too challenging for you, you are welcome to resort to pronouncing this letter like the letter R in English.
The Hebrew letter Resh is kind of like our R in English, and you might even think when writing it of the lowercase r written backwards. Some of us make our r's like this, and so this is how you make the Resh.
The letter Shin gets its name from the word for tooth, corresponding to the biblical Hebrew shein. Originally, this was one letter, but when it was realized that it had two different pronunciations, the Masoretes, a group of medieval Hebrew scribes, split it into two letters, Sin and Shin, by the mere distinction of a dot that appears either over the left side of the form for Sin, or over the right side of the form for Shin. For our purposes, the letter Sin may be read like the letter S in English, or like the Hebrew letter Samekh, though originally Sin would have been pronounced like a lateral lisp. The letter Shin is best treated like the SH sound in a word like shovel.
I'll talk now about the letters Sin and Shin in one go, and that's because really their base form is the same. You might think of it somewhat like a U that curves back in on itself on the left-hand side. If you want to make the letter Sin, you will put a dot here above the left side. Now, if you want to write the letter Shin, again, you will begin with that form of the base, and this time you're going to write a dot above the right-hand side. This is an important distinction to make because these are two separate letters, Sin and Shin.
The final letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Tav, the name of which can also mean a mark, like the mark that Ezekiel was told to put on the forehead of people in Ezekiel 9. Tav is another letter that has two different pronunciations depending on whether or not it has a dagesh. With the dagesh, Tav is pronounced like the T in telephone. Without the dagesh, Tav sounds somewhat, though not exactly, like the TH in Smith.
The final letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Tav, and you can begin by making a line like this, and then another one, kind of like a wishbone. The most important part, though, is this foot that you put going out from it to the left. Sometimes a Tav in cursive writing might look somewhat like a Chet that we met earlier, the 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And yet the difference will be, again, that left foot that comes out. Make sure that's there because that's an indicator that you're writing a Tav.
That brings us to the end of our tutorial on the Hebrew alphabet. I hope you found it helpful, and I wish you all the best in your continuing studies of the Hebrew language.